All right. Hi, everyone. I am Lindsay Border. I'm from Sensity. I'm here to introduce you to your speaker today. Thank you for attending this session, Developing Individual Holistic Communication Profiles on Learners Who Are Deafblind. We're here today with Susan Bruce. Susan Bruce, PhD, is a professor of special education at Boston College. She coordinates the master's degree programs in special education, extensive support needs, with an optional specialization in deafblindness. Her research interests are communication and early language development in learners with multiple disabilities and especially deafblindness, assessment, and collaborative action research. Susan has published 61 articles and chapters that specifically address the learning of children and young adults who are deafblind. She is the mother of 4 adult children, including a daughter with multiple disabilities. Okay, you can turn it over to Susan now.
Welcome, and thank you for attending this workshop session. So I want to tell you a little bit about where this profile came from. It actually started way back when I did my dissertation. I was a little bit older as a doctoral student, but back in '99 when I finished it. And I've changed it over the years. And so here's how I use this. This is something I've used in my preparation of master's level teachers, both those in deafblindness and those in multiple disabilities. I also use it when I work in teams at schools. So I'll go ahead and get started now. So developing individual holistic communication profiles on learners who are deafblind is the title. And what I mean by that is we're developing one profile for one person. So as we join together today, since this is a workshop, I have broken up the profile into 10 sections to make discussion and presentation a little bit easier. So I'll pause for you to record information as needed. What I'd like you to do is think of a learner. This works best. This profile is most appropriate for learners who are pre-linguistic, so early intentional communicators, through people who are early linguistic communicators. Those who are expressively fully linguistic would not need you to do a communication profile for them. So the purpose then is you can use this template, which is on the itinerary site that you have on your phones, and then I've passed out the hard copies that I brought, and I do have some flash drives if anyone wants it in that format. So you can use each of the headings as an assessment item, and you can also use it as a record. So when you're done with completing one of these holistic communication profiles on a child or an adult with the communication skills that I described a moment ago, you really have a very comprehensive can-do statement. And I will show you some sample excerpts from one that a team created, and actually after I prepared them and how to use the template that I'm going to show you today, a very early career speech-language pathologist took the lead and did just a marvelous job. So I've seen this work time and time again. And you know what happened? The teacher of the deaf moved on to another job. The teacher of the visually impaired also left and took another job. And then we lost a third team member, and it looks like possibly a fourth. So now I'm so grateful that we completed this and all the team members weighed in, because it will give some continuity for this child. And in adult services, I started my career actually in adult services. It's even more important because adult service providers change so often. So it's something that families could create for their adult learner who is communicating in the ways that I described earlier. So I would recommend then that it be updated every year. And you can also find a profile that was completed some years ago on a student that was named David, a pseudonym, by following the link that's on this slide. So every good assessment is grounded in some theory, right? We know that some assessments are developmental, some are more functional outcomes, perspective-based, and so on. So one of the theoretical groundings for this this assessment, and that's what it is, as well as being an assessment record, is the 4 aspects of communication, which solidly comes from the field of deafblindness. So I want to define these and then show you a little schematic, because I really think that the 4 aspects can capture a very holistic view of communication. So the first of the 4 aspects is form. Some of you may call that mode or modality. So it would include speech, signs, which I distinguish from sign language, finger spelling, the use of objects, or any mode of communication. So the word is form. I think it's easier to remember if there's the 2 F's and the 2 C's, and we use that a lot in the writings. If you know the book from 98 or 99, Remarkable Conversations out of Perkins, it also uses that structure, and it appeared even earlier than that. Function is the purpose of a message. So when someone communicates to you, are they refusing? That would be one function. Are they requesting? That's the one we focus on an awful lot. Commenting, we sometimes forget to teach how to comment, right? And so function is important. Sometimes people call that intent, but there is a slight difference that causes me to use the word function for this group of learners. Intent is what the sender of the communicative message had in mind as their purpose. Function is what the communication partner interpreted it to be. And since we are talking about early communicators, for myself, I like to use function out of respect that I might misinterpret someone's purpose. And this is relevant to learners other than those who are deafblind. For example, if someone is being sarcastic, some people will not pick that up as sarcasm. Therefore, the function and the intent could be different. Do you see what I mean? So that's why I'm using function, and our field uses it. Content is simple. If it's speech, sign, finger spelling, and so on, content is the message itself. But content is really difficult when someone is communicating to us through body language, or when we feel like we're using our expert knowledge as a parent or a professional about an individual, but we're not 100% certain precisely what the message is. It gets to be that 5 or 6 questions, hopefully not 20 question kind of thing. And then the 4th aspect is context. And what I did way back when I was working on my dissertation was expand that into 5 components, which you see listed here. Physical environment, the individual's characteristics, and I do not mean just disability characteristics. Hello? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Can we do all of it? Can we do parts of it? And what parts?
Oh, back again. Yeah, please prompt me if I do that. I'll try to hold my hand and I'll remember. Disability characteristics and non-disability characteristics, like just being shy. Okay? Communication partners, what they need to know to be effective, and the skills that are associated with the knowledge. Activities and routines, we know an awful lot about the importance of predictable activities and routines. And of course, the kind of messages, communication messages we would express in a classroom setting would be very different than what we might express at a bar with our friends, right? So activities and routines are part of context and drive what we do communicatively. And then the process of communication was something I added to the model, although we don't talk about this so often in deafblindness. This has to do with how does the individual initiate communication or interactions? How does the person sustain it? So how many turn-taking cycles and what skills are required to sustain a conversation and terminate a conversation? And I actually added that part of that component of the aspect of context because I was consulting in an inclusive preschool, and there were 5 boys with autism, and there were just all sorts of challenges we had around how to teach them how to initiate rather than parallel play, but also how to terminate. And I still to this day have visual images of them just leaving. You know, terminating a conversation is pretty tricky, and it's quite reliant on vision, isn't it? And also on just understanding subtle cues then. All right. So this shows you the model in another way because these all interact, right? So we're in a particular context, probably participating or observing a particular activity or routine, or both. And we communicate a message with a purpose in mind. So it's content expressed to achieve a function in a particular form. What I suggest to you is that in the field of education, and I'm sure this is true in adult services as well, sometimes professionals tend to concentrate on one of these aspects, perhaps at the expense of some other. And I can tell you from years and years of experience that function is the one we often neglect. That we're good at teaching some functions, but not all functions. So it helps to have some developmental understanding of which purposes of communication tend to be developed early on, and to teach children and adults to express those. All right, so you have the template in front of you, or you've downloaded it from the itinerary in the session as one of the documents. And what I'd like you to do then is to think of a learner who is a pre-linguistic communicator, intentional. That would be helpful. Intentional communicator, could be very early intentional, but probably doesn't express more than maybe 2 or 3 word utterances, or if they do have a number of those, they tend to be evoked in very specific circumstances, but not generalized a great deal. So if you can just pause for a moment and think about someone, I'll start working through the sections, and I'm hoping that you can actually use it as a workshop to start creating a profile. And I promise you, when you do this, you're going to have something really rich. The other thing I haven't told you yet is that because this is a template, there are parts you should kick out if they don't apply to your learner. For example, you don't want the play section if you're working with an adult, right? You probably don't. You might feel differently about that. The reason the play section is in there is because certain milestones in play that younger children achieve are very much correlated, not causal, but correlated of similar achievements in communication. For example, symbolic play and symbolic communication emerge at the same time. Not that one causes the other, but because a cognitive structure has been formed and manipulated, and so it's more of a reflection of cognition. I also have included some pivotal milestones that have very much been associated also with specific communication skill development areas. So I don't really believe when you work on communication, you can only work on communication, interaction, and language. I think that you also have to think about cognition. I think you need to think about the pivotal milestones, and I do believe you can teach object permanence across the age span. I think the same thing with means end and imitation. So it isn't just for younger learners, but you must teach in age-appropriate ways. And when I use the word teach, I'm using it broadly. As I said, I started in adult services, so that could be rehab settings, whatever setting you might be in then. So let's look at the first set of items, which really have to do with describing the learner. And hopefully you've got in mind this learner that you're thinking about who you serve. So obviously we put the name and the chronological age of the learner into the form. I have added in the last year or so some considerations that are more around thinking about culture and language, and I think the profile could be improved further, so you might want to do even more with that. But I did add the family's first language, so I think that's important. To record the identified disabilities, and if you know the etiology of the deafblindness, then I think that's good to include. And one of the reasons that's important is because some etiologies are associated with certain characteristics or behaviors like high anxiety levels. And while we would never, ever assume that everyone with, for example, Charge syndrome has a high anxiety, we should still be appreciative of the potential that an etiology contributes to certain characteristics. And it helps us, I think, also to be more mindful about that for the child or adult. And then under the vision section of the template, you should be writing about their acuity, their visual field, so important, If some of the visual field is no longer available to the learner, then we have to be very mindful of where we present visual signs, don't we? Or where we present objects if we're asking them to make a choice. So we include this information, CVI, and also some learners with deaf blindness who are early communicators might not be doing so well with wearing their hearing aids and their glasses. So those are important too. Where are we with learning to use and take care of our glasses? And then the corollary of that, the type and level of hearing loss, their use of hearing aids, whether or not they have a cochlear implant or two, and how things are going with that. Are they wearing them? Many of us work with learners who have these devices, but they're not wearing them much of the day. And so that becomes something we have to address through our instruction then. And then other sensory information, I'm sure you'll have many of your own ideas, but for example, I call them sensory sensitivities. We all have different sensory needs, right? It isn't just people who are deafblind or people with autism who are driven a little bit buggy by having tags on their clothing. There are plenty of people who have not yet been identified with a disability who are bothered by that, or textures in our food that we just can't stand. We can't even figure out whether we like the taste or not because it doesn't matter because we don't like the way it feels in our mouth, right? So any sensory information that would be helpful. And maybe it's like some unusual sensory capacity that's very positive. It could be either that or something that's offensive. And this is, of course, information so that we come to know the child. And then new team members can get a picture quite quickly. Motor status, including fine motor and gross motor. And then their placement. So what group home are they in? What are they in the family home? What school are they in if they're still in the educational setting? And then, of course, you may also want to include the assistive technologies, and I already mentioned about cochlear implants and glasses and so forth. All right, any questions on the first section?
All these known medical things I won't go through.
Yes.
She loves music.
Cortical visual impairment. So it's more of a brain-based vision loss. Yeah.
She was my first
Absolutely.
student outside of my old students that I had in class. In my
All right, I hope you're thinking of a learner and jotting down some ideas. All right, let's go on to the second section. And again, this isn't completely correlating with the sequence in the template, but I had to cluster some ideas to make it easier to try to do this as a workshop. So oftentimes we talk about what level of communication someone uses, and usually we're thinking about expressive, but we do want to remember that many people have a much higher receptive level of communication. My own daughter, who passed away recently, understood much of language, but was more limited in her expression. So the first level is pre-intentional behavior. And then you become intentional in behavior. It is very important to be honest with ourselves about whether someone is intentional in behavior or at the next level, which is unconventional communication, which is the first step of intentional communication. When you are intentional in behavior, you act on objects. When you become intentional in your communication, you have a thought in mind, a message, and you want to share it with another person. So switch use often confounds that, and people talk about it all the time. I'm not sure they really meant to send the message that Sarah recorded for them, right? Or whether that's more like I hit the switch because I really like the sound of it, and I'm able to hear that and enjoy it. So that's an important example to distinguish this. When we become intentional in our communication, in the very beginning, it may be unconventional, and then you can see it moves to being more conventional. So let me briefly explain that. Conventional communication means that most people in your culture, and sometimes across culture, would understand what you meant. And it can be on the body. That's okay. It's okay. And some things are cross-cultural. And the one that comes to mind probably isn't the nicest one to demonstrate, but you'll know what I mean. How little kids, when they have to go to the bathroom, cross-culturally, most of us would recognize that, I think, as, oh boy, we better find a bathroom really, really quickly. All right, so it becomes more conventional. Sometimes we say unconventional is like idiosyncratic, unique to the individual. And it's important that we capture those ideas on the profile because there's so many transitions in their lives. So many people come and go, and we can't keep starting all over with assessing and expressing their communicative abilities every year. They lose time, and that's not fair to them. We're wasting their time. Concrete symbols, which actually, when we talk about tangible symbols, and I will use that phrase because it's used in our field, but it's actually a misnomer. Tangible symbols are iconic if they look like what they represent, or they are the actual thing and are simply mounted. They're, strictly speaking, not symbols. Symbols are abstract by nature. So we do want to think about the difference there. And then abstract symbols, they do not look like what they represent, and that's very important to the development of language.
But it wasn't everything.
Any questions so far on that second
When I
part?
set foot in the school, there was more information that I gathered,
No?
especially
So one way you can assess the levels of communication very, very well is by using the communication matrix. And I believe in the reference section under Roland's entry, I put a link for you, but you can also just Google communication matrix and get a free access to it. And what's really awesome is she collects data over time. So if you assess the child using that free tool, which is used extensively around the world in deafblindness and also in multiple disabilities, then she'll have a record of the child's performance that you can build on over time. So the template then embeds other assessments, and the communication matrix is one of them. The communication matrix in itself is a great tool, but it is not the be-all, end-all. It doesn't tell us enough about communication, but it will help you to define very clearly the levels of communication across a very limited number of intents or function, 4 of them as opposed to potentially many more. So the third and fourth sections of this template that you're looking at, I hope, are about the child or adult's expressive and receptive forms. And sometimes those are different, aren't they? Okay, so that would include body language and facial expressions. Some people, that's how they express themselves, right? But they may not maybe attend so much to that receptively, right? Or they may not be able to see it receptively. Vocalization, that's different than verbalization. So, how many people go, to call you into their space? So common, right? So specific vocalizations. They might use objects or partial objects. They might use textures. They might use photographs, pictures, homemade drawings, coactively drawn drawings, line drawings. By that I mean the commercially produced ones like Mayor Johnson, which are quite abstract, so be careful with those, please. Gestures, which can be contact gesture. I use the phrase contact point if the person actually touches something. Proximal, pointing, or any kind of proximal gesture within a couple feet of their body, and distal would be beyond a few feet from their body. Signs, I distinguish signs from sign language because many people use 10 or 12 signs or maybe even more than that, but perhaps don't combine them in flexible ways to tell us that they are linguistic then. Verbalizations, so speaking words, and then assistive technologies that help you to deliver your message. So you would then record which ones the person you're thinking about uses. Okay, let me pause and see if you have any questions yet.
we had talked about.
No? Okay.
So I knew I had an idea of the profile, but
So I wanted to share this. This is something that was just completed in the last 6 months. I mentioned to you that a very early career SLP did it, and I was just blown away by how she went and saw all the team members and gathered this information. So this is on a 7-year-old boy with charge syndrome, deafblind. And so this is an excerpt on the just the sign part under expressive communication forms. That's one tiny part. And the team determined that he would say more with a vocalization, and then they put in parentheses, it was mo, 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 but they knew what that meant. So now new people will know what that means. Help, he did if you gave him a little bit of support with the hands. In an American Sign, here's help. So sometimes the two-handedness is a little tricky for the children, or the hand shape itself. He would repeat by. He would, in sign language, he would say go in sign language. He did all done and rest, but they were approximations, meaning that a stranger who knew sign language might not recognize his signs, but might if they had a lot of experience with signs. Ball, he could imitate. Walk, he could imitate. Dance, he could imitate. Jump, he imitated. He could babble in signs, so he's starting to move his hands around, but they weren't recognizable signs to us, but that's really encouraging when someone is babbling in sign. He had 2 staff names that he signed independently, and he did bathroom with some support, which was a big accomplishment because he really didn't care about going to the bathroom at all, so there wasn't that motivation except to please other people. All right, so you would go through then on that section 2 and record all of the expressive forms that the person uses, and this just gives you some examples then of what that looked like for this one person that I'm referring to as Jay. Now, let's get into the functions, because this is where we often forget to spend much time. So we should be thinking about the early 8 to 10 functions that most human beings achieve. And this has held across regardless of disability, as far as we know based on the research we currently have. So these are the things we tend to do early on, and then we add additional things later, like asking questions. That comes later, right? Much later, and you know that from your work. So we like to call attention to ourselves, and as an infant, we want that to meet our basic needs, and as young children. And that can happen then in any form or modality, right? You could call attention with a gesture. You could call attention by just going, ah, until someone got there. And some kids go, ah, and others go, ah, wait, they're not coming yet, ah, and they don't bother doing a continuous stream of that vocalization. So common. We see it across dozens and dozens of kids when you're in the field long enough. Answering. Now this one, let's remember, answering isn't just in sign or verbalization. I propose to you, and I've always done this in my research, if someone complies through an action, they are answering you. They're showing you they understood. So again, for each of these functions or intents, you need to think about it across communication forms or modes. So how do they answer? In what form? How do they protest and refuse? And let's not be afraid to teach young children to say no, because they're going to tell us no in another way anyway. And still we find sometimes kids are engaging in unappreciated behaviors, but they don't have another way to say no or go away, or I'm really sick of that. And so we want to make sure those are among the messages we teach. And when we're consulting, we can check to make sure that's happening, especially if we're seeing behaviors that others are complaining about. How do they request for action, which could be something like helping them with something or feeding them or playing with them? How do they request an object? And we can create situations to elicit each of these early intents. That's what I'm saying, that we need to be educating, instructing these. Labels and names. Do you know that we tend to forget to label things? Well, it's good for the kids to know names of things and labels of things. In blindness, sometimes we do some labeling in Braille, maybe not as much as we used to in the old days. But it's important to label in their expressive form so that they can learn names of things. Commenting on action. I can remember one of my students many years ago who had just a few signs, communicated a lot through his body. He was deafblind due to rubella, and he took my hand. We had one of those, I don't remember what it was called, but it was a ball that had all these little rounded, I want to call them spikes, but they weren't pointed or anything. And I called it bumble ball. I don't know if that was the name, but it vibrated. And he took my hand one time and he isolated my finger. And he was someone that the psychologist referred to as untestable. And he took my hand and he showed me the rise of it and around the top and around the side of it. I consider that a comment on an object through body language, right? Yeah. So we want to think about this very thoroughly. Greetings, how did they greet us? Are we teaching greetings? And then there may be additional functions. So let me pause here and see if you have any questions on the functions. So these are the ones they're most likely to learn earlier on. And requests and protests and calling for attention would be probably the three earliest for most children. So then this is another excerpt from Jay's completed communication profile. Forms used to express the function of requesting action. So next to requesting action, they've written in that he signs more. He starts stimming behaviors, which they interpret. He giggles and laughs. He touches or reaches for you, so he's using adults as tools, you know. Sometimes grabs your hand to get you to do something. Puts objects in your hand. Often that was so that you would activate them for him, because the fine motor piece might be a little tricky. And he would also lift the corner of his shirt in anticipation of his G-tube feeding. So that's just one excerpt on one child. And again, there's a completed profile on another child that I have a link for in the PowerPoint. All right, the sixth section then is vocabulary. These would be words, signs, tangible symbols. So this is pretty easy to explain. So what is their vocabulary? Once you get into hundreds of vocabulary signs or words, I mean, you're kind of grown past the profile, right? And you're focusing more on sentence construction, flexible use of language. And so the profile is really not so appropriate anymore. But for the early communicators, it might look more like there's, maybe 8 to 10 gestures for some of them, maybe some signs and so on, and some tangible symbols. Does everyone know what I mean by that? Like whole objects, partial objects, things you can touch, often three-dimensional, sometimes not. All right. Any questions on content? So you would be thinking about all of the words, basically, that they are expressing, but that doesn't mean it has to be verbalization. It can be signs, it can be objects, and so on. The seventh section, then, is context, which includes the physical environment. So you're going to think about what's most conducive for their expressive communication. And you can think about receptive also, because lighting is super important to that, too. So you'll think about lighting, the auditory characteristics of the environment, equipment, even clutter could play a role. Clutter makes some people very nervous, and then they're not so receptive. Clutter also impairs your ability to move around, so that might also be important. The individual's characteristics, disability and non-disability. I was doing a study in one classroom, and I'm embarrassed to say this many years ago, I was thinking about this as disability characteristics only. And then I realized this little girl came in and her hair was hanging over her face. She couldn't see anything and she had low vision. And I'm thinking, okay. And then I look at her and how gregarious she is, and I'm thinking, okay, you're wrong about this. You have to expand this to any kind of characteristic then that might influence communication. So it's disability and non-disability. Thinking about what skills communication partners need. That would include how many signs they need to know. They need to know more than the child. They do not grow on trees. One of my frustrations as a parent was how many years we had teachers who knew far fewer signs than my daughter did. And yet they'd say, oh, she only expanded by X number of signs, and sometimes they taught her an incorrect sign. That's very frustrating. And that happens a lot when an individual has disabilities or delayed development, not just deaf blindness per se. So that's very important. So owning what skills we need to be competent communication partners is important. Activities and routines. So routines lend predictability, and predictability lends emotional safety. Very important. We need within activity routines and between activity routines, which we sometimes think about as transitions, but it's more than that. And what kind of communication occurs within these routines. So when you know what's going to happen and you know the possibilities, it increases your anticipation, and that can then inspire you to express yourself. And we want those activities to be worthwhile, right? They can be fun, too. I'm not saying everything has to be all business, but worthwhile for the individual. And then this next one I think is kind of tricky. How does the person initiate communication, and is it effective? And that would include joint attention, wouldn't it? That also includes that receptively we're making sure we have their attention. And joint attention might be tactual. For a long time in autism, there were an awful lot of lessons on look at me, look at me, look at me. And I watch these and I think, well, when in your life does someone tell you 10 times in discrete trial to look at you? You would think that was the most bizarre thing. Or you'd read on an education plan that they would look at you for 5 seconds. In America, if you stare at somebody for 5 seconds, they're going to be worried about you. We don't make eye contact for that long. We become very, very uncomfortable very quickly. And then we learn from people with autism that often when they're not looking at us, they're actually listening more closely. So adults with autism, adults who are deafblind, teach us a lot of important things, don't they, that we have to consider. But how are they initiating? How are they sustaining? And maybe that's going to be at a physical level. So many of you have been taught a lot of the principles that Van Dyke gave to us, right, around child-guided instruction and his approach to assessment. So how do you sustain interactions or communication? And then how do you terminate? Terminating is really hard. Think of the things we do when we're really done with talking to someone or signing with them. We kind of look away, we back away. These are really hard. So how do they terminate? How do you know when they're done? Any questions on number 7 then?
She would notice things that I hadn't, but she needed context.
No? Okay, we're getting there. Number 8 then is pivotal milestones. Now, I don't have time today to go through these. I do presentations on just this part. But each of the milestones on this page have been absolutely correlated with specific communicative developments in younger children. I've also been very effective in teaching older children, even secondary age children, to achieve some of these. So don't give up on them, but you now have to teach it in a different way. And they are joint attention, which could be tactually expressed. All right. Imitation. Imitation is worth working on for a very long time in creative ways, because when you can imitate, your learning efficiency takes off. Without imitation, everything you learn is going to be very slowly achieved. Object permanence, knowing that people and objects continue to exist when you can't see them, hear them, or touch them. And there's a lot of interesting literature about on the role of vision in object permanence. Even some vision is extremely helpful. And blind children actually progress more quickly over a problematic stage of object permanence than sighted children, because they are forced to use their cognition in a different way early on. So it's interesting to me anyway. Means end is a form of problem solving, basically, where there's some kind of a barrier. And you can think really creatively about what the barrier might be. For example, we had a middle school age student who had multiple disabilities and was visually impaired, and he had an interest in remote control cars. So the OTs built this fabulous desktop platform with a little bit of a barrier, and we taught him to operate just a simple remote controlled car going forward and backwards, and he would feel a vibration or hear when it hit each end, and he would know then to hit the button. But that actually was a mean ends task, and I always show that film to my students because it's not immediately intuitive. The reason it's a means end task is because when you want to go forward, you have to go in one direction. When you want to go backward, you have to push the switch in another direction. So think about means end in creative ways and ways that are age appropriate then. Discrimination and categorization are sometimes put together. So we discriminate visually, tactually, auditorily, through our sense of taste, our sense of smell, and then categorization. So you really can't categorize anything unless you can discriminate on some basis. So one leads to the other. I've just listed them separately. So working on lessons that are practical, but that teach discrimination and categorization. So you can see here my bias toward thinking about some of the psychological aspects and the cognitive aspects as part of communication. I do not believe you can work on communication in isolation.
That's perfect also. You can get more people.
And then I put a couple images here on the slide. The one is the son imitating the father shaving, and we can tell that's very visually based, more than likely. And then we see a child looking for an object under a blanket, which would be an object permanence task. And there's a whole schema. I even have assessments on these milestones. If you're interested, you could write me, that are grounded in research, and they're all have modifications for someone with visual impairment. So feel free to write me, and I'll write you back when I get back home. So an excerpt from Jay's actual completed profile then. He would imitate the following signs: ball, walk, same, dance, jump, high, bathroom, by, go, one, and help. We were working on 1 and 2 numbers concepts. He could imitate the following actions: clapping, drawing on an iPad app, stretchy tubes, you know those things that go accordion tubes, putting rocks or bears in a cup, throwing a ball into a basket. So that is the total, for this child, the total number of examples an entire team could think of around imitating signs and imitating actions. Now, he also had a few independent signs. He no longer needed, we're no longer working on imitation of those. Okay. And then the 9th section is on object handling in play. If you Google the play assessment questionnaire, you will have a free assessment that was developed for deaf children. And Ogura has a really interesting play schema that I mentioned here. This shows a sequence of play development. So we start by manipulating things without any particular real intention. We're touching them and moving them about. And then we become interested in the sensory effects, so the sound, the visual effects of it, or possibly the tactile responses. And then we begin to relate one object to another, and there's a number of stages within that we can work on. And then we begin to name objects and use them more functionally in play. And then we get into symbolic play, and there's also a sequence of how humans develop symbolic play, and it's very similar for deaf children and blind children as it is with sighted children. And then we do combinatorial symbolic play, and finally we actually plan play, which would include like thinking of play schemas, gathering equipment, and by this stage we're also, with symbolic play, learning to substitute things. So like if we were out somewhere and we wanted to represent people, but there were no dolls or men that we could use, we might pick up a stick and put it in the ground and say this is a person. So all of those kind of skills develop over time, and there's a lot of rich research then on that. Are there any questions on this? Okay, we're coming to the end here. And then there are a cluster of other things that are related to communication that I think are important to include. How the person shares affective states with others. Examples of memory could be important for early communicators. Remember, you can just delete anything from the electronic template that you don't want anymore. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot again. Hold on. Yep. I'm moving it on 2 devices here. Thank you, appreciate that. How they express preferences, choice making, do they make real authentic selections? Individuation, your sense of self. Persistence and repair. This is big. When I collected data for the struggle to symbolism study, and there were over 20 children who were deafblind, I did not receive repair until a child was at a particular level on the communication matrix. That was pretty interesting. So for a long time as early communicators, we'll do the same thing again, hoping for a better result, or maybe our partner wasn't paying attention. But then after a while, with more mature communication, we realize, oh, geez, they're not getting it. I better change what I do. And we try something else. That's what a repair is. So they learn to repair it. That's very significant development. And it means it's one of the signs you're getting closer to language, because it's the cognition manipulating those thoughts. It's complex. A variety of functions of communication, literacy lessons that support communication. I make sure that everyone that leaves our master's program knows how to implement a set of 5 or 6 literacy lessons with excellence, or they don't complete. I make sure of that in a kind, supportive way. So they all know how to do different kinds of calendar systems and schedules, story boxes, experience books, interactive homeschool journals, not just a note home, and so on. And I present quite a bit on those. And of course, then we have to have a recommendations section. So based on all of this rich information you've collected, what would you recommend be the emphasis in programming? Highlighting a few things. think about your recommendations across the 4 aspects, and please don't forget intents and functions, because that's the one at least teachers tend to forget. Consider the strategies you would recommend and any need for professional development, by the way, or support to families. Consider the pivotal milestones, at least for the children, I would say, who are maybe under 12, and then maybe beyond for some. Consider their object handling and their play. Consider the other items that were on the one slide on the profile and the literacy lessons that you might recommend. And then I've included the references. Here you'll see a link to the profile that includes a sample. It was in an article, so it's a sample of a profile on another child, not the excerpts I showed you today. And then there's also a link to the communication matrix there, and you can access that. And then Charity Rowland will keep data for you over time. And that last reference also has to do with the play assessment. So I hope this is helpful. It gives you some ideas of some absolutely free assessments that are embedded into the template, and gives you a way to not only have a structure that's really holistic and complete around communication, you could add your own. Sometimes I think about adding pragmatics, to it. But I'm retiring next year, so I'll leave that to other people to improve on it. There's some growth, I think, in culturally sustaining or affirming pedagogy that could be added to this over time as well. Are there any questions? Yes.
I have a couple. My name is Daniel. I'm a speech pathologist. I work in Montreal. I have a question about the literacy activities that you use, and if you could give a few more examples of the story boxes and other forms of literacy for the deafblind child.
Oh boy, you've asked for it now, and I know we're at time, so some of you might have to leave, and I'll have to clear out in about 5 minutes or so for the next person. All right, so I distinguish individualizing from personalizing. And I borrowed this from I distinguish between individualizing and personalizing. That's the backdrop. So, and I borrow the personalizing from early childhood, but my Lord, we should have been the first to write about it in our field, because we are good at this. Personalizing means it's about your lived experiences. It's also very easy to relate a naturally related thing to culturally sustaining or affirming pedagogies, right? So a story box can be a set of objects that correspond to a commercially produced book, but it could be, which would be an individualized to the child and personalized, but it could also be corresponding to a book that you wrote with the child, perhaps, or even without a book, a story box could be a collection of items you gathered when you were on a walk, or you went to a party and you brought some things back and then you signed about them. So story boxes appear in different ways. Experience books are sort of a close relative. An experience book is when you share an experience with the child. The person who shares that experience ought to be the one that develops it coactively with the child. Easier said than done, because their little hands get in the glue when they're young, and it can be like that. But the idea is story boxes and experience books pull up memory. And we need to work on memory and sharing memories, including the affective experiences that occurred during those shared experiences. So we know that peaks of emotion, positive and negative, but as instructors we don't use the negative so much for teaching, are what actually pulls up memory best, rather than more neutral responses. And so an important concept for this is saliency. You pick things for story boxes and experience books with the learner, child or adult, any age, but they have to be based on what was important or salient to them. So we watch and we listen. You and I go to a park, and what we come away remembering is not necessarily what stood out to the child at all. I have so many stories in my head. Like, we took a bunch of kids who were blind camping. Some of them were, actually a bunch of them were deafblind. And one of the kids was always throwing his shoes. And for the first time, he threw it down one of those horrible old latrines. And both his teacher and I got smacked because it was his first experience in life of not being able to get back something he threw. We weren't going to go down there. He was demanding it. We had to figure out whether we were brave enough to put a shoelace, because he knew that as a representation of his tennis shoe. Were we brave enough and honest enough to put it in the book and kind of duck when we reviewed it? And we did. We had to, because to him, I guarantee you, the most memorable part of that camping experience, the most salient part, was those stupid teachers, and he told us we were stupid, who couldn't figure out how to get his shoe back. You get, you clean. That's the message. You understand? Okay. And then daily schedules, which build into weekly and possibly monthly, or talking about seasons. I like interactive journals, but I know we have to end, so if you want to email me, I can send you some materials. I have all kinds of PowerPoints on this. Probably some recordings, too. All right. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you.